On the night I became his wife, he looked at me like I was already forgotten. The chandelier above us shimmered like frozen stars, too bright, too cold, casting light over a room full of people who didn't know my name but knew exactly what I was worth. I stood there in a white dress that didn't feel like mine, the fabric heavy against my skin, the air too still, too expensive, like even breathing required permission, and across from me stood Victor Kane, 65 years old, perfectly tailored in black, his silver hair catching the light, his expression carved from something harder than stone, a man who didn't smile because he didn't need to. Power had already done that for him. I remember thinking he didn't look at people, he evaluated them, measured them, decided if they mattered, and in that moment, I knew I didn't, not to him, not yet. The officiant's voice faded into the background, words about union and commitment dissolving into noise because none of it was real, not the vows, not the ring sliding onto my finger, not the polite applause that followed. This wasn't a wedding, it was a transaction dressed up in lace and gold, and I was the price. But what they didn't know, what he didn't know, was that I had chosen this. Every step, every second, every lie that led me here, I had walked into his world with my eyes open, because sometimes survival doesn't look like running, sometimes it looks like standing still and letting the storm come to you. He didn't touch me after the ceremony, didn't offer his arm, didn't even glance my way as the guests surrounded him, men in dark suits speaking in low voices, women in diamonds pretending not to stare. I stood alone at the edge of it all, invisible in plain sight, until his voice cut through the noise, low and controlled. We're leaving. No explanation, no softness, just a command, and somehow, my feet moved before I could think. The car ride was silent, the city lights passing by in blurred streaks, New York stretching out around us like a living thing, restless and indifferent. I counted the seconds between breaths, the space between us measured in inches but feeling like miles, and when we finally stopped, it wasn't a house, it was a fortress, glass and steel rising into the night, guarded without being obvious, the kind of place that didn't need to announce its power because it already knew it had it. Inside, everything was pristine, untouched, like no one actually lived there, like it existed only to impress or intimidate, maybe both. I followed him upstairs, heels clicking against marble, each step echoing louder than it should, until we reached a door at the end of a long hallway. He opened it without looking back, and I stepped inside. The room was vast, dimly lit, the bed too large, too perfect, like it belonged in a magazine instead of a life. I turned to him then, waiting for something, anything, a word, a glance, a sign that this meant more than what it looked like, but he didn't hesitate, didn't soften, didn't even pause. He simply adjusted his cuff, his voice calm, almost bored. You mean nothing. And for a moment, the world went quiet, not shattered, not broken, just still. Like everything inside me had decided to hold its breath, and then, slowly, I smiled, not because it didn't hurt, but because I had expected it, because this was the man I had married, and this was exactly where my story was supposed to begin. I did not cry after he said it, not when the door closed behind him with that quiet, final click, not when the silence settled into the room like it belonged there more than I did. I just stood in the middle of that too perfect space, the weight of the dress still pressing down on my shoulders, my fingers brushing over the ring on my hand as if I needed to confirm it was real, because everything about this felt unreal in a way that was almost deliberate, like a stage set designed to look convincing but never meant to be lived in. I exhaled slowly, steadying myself, because this was the moment that mattered, not the words he had said, not the coldness in his voice, but what I chose to do next. I moved toward the window, the city stretching out beneath me in endless lights, yellow and white dots scattered across the dark like a map of lives I would never return to. Somewhere out there was the apartment I used to call home, the one with the flickering kitchen light and the cracked tile floor, the place where I counted every dollar and every hour and every second until the next bill came due. And I realized something then, something sharp and clear. I had not been taken from that life, I had stepped away from it, willingly, deliberately, and that meant I could not afford to feel small now, not here, not in a place where everything was built to make people feel exactly that. I reached up and loosened the pins in my hair, letting it fall down around my shoulders, the reflection in the glass staring back at me like someone I barely recognized, softer than I felt, quieter than I needed to be. I changed out of the dress carefully, folding it instead of throwing it aside, because control started with small things, with the way you handled what was given to you. Even if it was never truly yours, the closet was already filled. Rows of clothing in neutral tones, elegant, expensive, untouched, all chosen without me. I ran my fingers along the fabric, not impressed, not intimidated, just observing, cataloging, understanding the world I had entered piece by piece. When I stepped back into the room, it felt different, not because anything had changed, but because I was no longer standing there waiting for him to define what this meant. I had already decided. A soft knock broke the silence, precise, respectful. I opened the door to find a woman in her 50s, composed, her posture straight, her expression carefully neutral. "Miss Carter," she said, then corrected herself almost immediately. "Mrs. Kane, I am Margaret, I oversee the household." Her voice was calm, practiced, like she had delivered variations of this introduction 100 times before. I nodded once, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "Emily is fine," I said, my voice steady, not loud, not defensive, just certain. Something flickered in her eyes. Not surprise, not quite approval, but something close. "Of course," she replied, stepping slightly aside. "If you need anything, the staff is available at all hours." I considered that for a moment. The idea of needing something in a place like this felt almost ironic, but I nodded. "Again, thank you." She lingered for half a second, as if expecting more, then inclined her head and walked away, the hallway swallowing the sound of her footsteps almost immediately. I closed the door gently, not rushing, not reacting, just moving with intention, and as I turned back toward the room, I felt it settle into place inside me. This was not a prison, not yet, and it would not become one unless I let it. Victor Kane might have believed he had purchased silence, compliance, something easy to ignore, but he had not asked the right questions, he had not looked closely enough, and that was his first mistake. I walked back to the window, the city still glowing beneath me, alive and indifferent, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself a small, quiet truth. I was not here to be owned, I was here for something else entirely, and sooner or later, he was going to realize exactly what that meant. The next morning did not feel like a beginning, it felt like a test, and I realized that before my eyes were even fully open, the silence in that place was different, controlled, intentional, like every sound had been filtered through someone else's permission. I sat up slowly, the unfamiliar bed too perfect beneath me, the sheets smooth and untouched as if they had been waiting for someone else entirely. For a moment I let myself stay still, listening, trying to understand the rhythm of this new world, and then I moved, because staying still too long was how people lost themselves. The bathroom was larger than my entire old apartment kitchen, marble surfaces, polished mirrors, everything arranged with a precision that made it feel more like a showroom than a place meant for living. I studied my reflection again, not searching for beauty, not searching for weakness, just looking for truth. And what I saw was someone who had not broken, not yet. Downstairs, the air shifted the moment I stepped into the main floor, subtle but unmistakable, conversations lowered, footsteps adjusted, not because I demanded it, but because of the name I now carried, Kane. It moved ahead of me like a shadow, shaping how people reacted before I even spoke. Margaret appeared almost immediately, as if she had been waiting just out of sight. "Good morning, Emily," she said, her tone neutral but attentive. I noticed she had not used the title this time, and I filed that away quietly. "Breakfast is ready whenever you are." I nodded once, following her into a dining room that felt too large for a single person. The table could have seated 12 comfortably, but only one place had been set. The silverware aligned perfectly, the coffee already poured, steam rising in thin, controlled curls. I sat down without hesitation, not at the end of the table, not in the center, just somewhere natural, somewhere that felt like a choice instead of an assignment. The first sip of coffee grounded me more than anything else had so far. Familiar, simple, real. "Does he always leave this early?" I asked, my voice calm, not curious, just gathering information. Margaret paused for half a second before answering. "Mr. Kane keeps a structured schedule," she said carefully, which was not an answer, but it told me enough. He was already gone, already back in his world where I did not exist unless necessary. I nodded again, letting the silence return, because silence could be useful if you knew how to use it. After breakfast, I did not ask for permission, I did not wait for instruction. I walked through the halls, past rooms that looked untouched, through spaces that felt more like displays than parts of a home. I was mapping it, learning it, understanding the boundaries. Without being told where they were, a man in a dark suit stood near one of the side entrances, his posture alert but not aggressive, his eyes flicking toward me briefly before returning forward, trained, disciplined, part of the system that kept this place running. "Is there a garden?" I asked, stopping a few feet away. He hesitated just long enough for me to notice, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am, through the east corridor." I smiled faintly. Not because I felt like it, but because it mattered. "Thank you." Outside, the air was cooler, cleaner, the city noise distant but present, a reminder that the world still existed beyond these walls. The garden was perfectly maintained, every line intentional, every plant placed with care, beautiful, but controlled. Like everything else here, I walked slowly along the path, letting my fingers brush lightly against the leaves, grounding myself in something real again, and that was when I felt it. Not a sound, not a movement, just a shift, the kind you notice when someone is watching you. I did not turn immediately, I did not react, I simply continued walking, counting my steps, measuring my breath. And then, slowly, I glanced back toward the house, toward the tall windows reflecting the morning light, and there, just for a second, I saw him, Victor Kane, standing still, watching, not approaching, not calling out, just observing, like he was trying to understand something that did not fit into his world as easily as everything else did. And for the first time since last night, I realized something had changed, not in me, but in him. Because men like Victor Kane did not watch things that meant nothing, and yet, there he was, standing behind the glass, looking directly at me as if I had just become a question he could not ignore. I did not look away when I saw him watching me, not immediately, because looking away too fast would have meant I felt caught, and I refused to give him that, so instead I let my gaze rest there for one steady second longer than necessary before turning back to the path, as if his presence behind the glass changed nothing, as if men like him did not alter the air around them just by existing, but I felt it, that quiet shift, the kind that did not announce itself but settled deep under the skin. And I knew he had noticed it too, because people like Victor Kane noticed everything that did not follow expectation. I continued walking through the garden, my steps even, my breathing controlled, letting the moment stretch without reacting to it, because reaction was a form of surrender in a place like this, and I was not here to surrender. When I finally made my way back inside, the house felt different again, not in structure, not in sound, but in awareness, like something unseen had shifted position. I found Margaret near the base of the stairs, reviewing something on a tablet, her posture as composed as ever, but her eyes flicked toward me with a trace more attention than before. "Will you be needing anything this afternoon?" she asked, her tone polite but measured. I considered the question, not for what it offered, but for what it revealed. Everything here ran on anticipation, on predicting needs before they were spoken. "No," I replied simply, then added after a brief pause, "but I would like to know how things work here." Her expression remained neutral, but I saw it again, that subtle flicker, the kind that came when something did not fit the expected pattern. "Of course," she said, "the staff operates on a fixed schedule, meals are prepared at set times, and security maintains the perimeter at all hours." I nodded, absorbing each detail, not as information, but as structure, because structure could be understood, and what could be understood could be navigated. "And him?" I asked, my voice still calm, still even. Margaret hesitated again, longer this time. "Mr. Kane does not usually discuss his schedule," she said carefully, which meant she knew more than she was saying, and that was enough for now. I did not press further, because pushing too soon would have closed doors I had not yet fully seen. Instead I thanked her and moved on, choosing to explore the upper level next, each room revealing more of the same controlled elegance, spaces designed to impress, not to comfort. Until I reached a study at the far end of the hallway, the door slightly ajar. I paused there, not out of hesitation, but calculation, because entering a space like that without permission meant something. It set a line, and once crossed, it could not be undone. But then I remembered his words, "You mean nothing," and I realized something important. If I meant nothing, then nothing I did here should matter. So I pushed the door open, quietly, deliberately. The room inside was darker, warmer, lined with shelves filled with books that looked read, not displayed, a contrast to everything else in the house. The desk was clean but not untouched, papers aligned with precision, a glass of water set exactly to the right, and behind it, the chair he had likely sat in hours earlier. I stepped inside slowly, not touching anything yet, just observing, understanding, because this was different. This space felt like it belonged to him in a way the rest of the house did not. It was not for show, it was for control, and as I moved closer to the desk, I noticed a photograph, simple, unframed, placed just slightly off-center. It showed a much younger Victor Kane, standing beside a woman whose face was softened by time and memory, her smile real in a way I had not yet seen in him. I studied it for a moment, longer than I should have, because it told me something I had not expected, that there had been a version of him that existed before the silence, before the distance, before whatever had turned him into the man who could stand in front of his wife and say she meant nothing. I set the photograph back exactly where I found it, not out of respect, but out of strategy, and that was when I heard it. A voice behind me, low, controlled, unmistakable. "You should not be in here." I turned slowly, not startled, not defensive, just aware, meeting his gaze without hesitation, because this was the moment that mattered, not the rule I had broken, but how I chose to stand after breaking it. And as I looked at him, I realized something had shifted again, because this time, he was not just looking at me like I was nothing, he was looking at me like I had just crossed into something he could not ignore. He did not raise his voice, and somehow that made it heavier, like the air itself had decided to listen. I met his gaze without moving, without stepping back, because stepping back would have meant I accepted the boundary he had just drawn, and I was not ready to accept anything from him, not yet. "Then you should lock the door," I said quietly, my voice steady, not challenging, not apologizing, just stating something simple and true. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, not surprise, something sharper, something that measured, evaluated, recalculated. He stepped further into the room, closing the distance between us with the kind of controlled movement that made it clear he was used to being obeyed without question. "This is not a place you wander into," he said, his tone calm, precise, like every word had been chosen long before he spoke it. I tilted my head slightly, considering him, not as a man of power, not as my husband, but as a variable I needed to understand. "I was not wandering," I replied, "I was learning." The silence that followed stretched just long enough to matter, because that was not the answer he expected. I could see it in the way his posture shifted, subtle, almost invisible. "But there, learning what?" he asked, his gaze narrowing just slightly. I let my eyes move briefly around the room before returning to him. "The rules," I said, and then, after a beat, "And which ones are real?" Something in his expression hardened then, not outwardly, not in a way most people would notice, but I saw it, because I was looking for it. "You do not need to concern yourself with that," he said, dismissing the idea with the ease of someone who believed control was permanent. I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it told me exactly what I needed to know. "I think I do," I said, still calm, still measured, "because I am the one living here." His eyes held mine for a moment longer, searching, testing, trying to place me into a category that made sense, but I did not give him one. I stayed exactly where I was, exactly as I was, until he looked away first, just slightly, just enough to break the line between us. And that was when I knew something had shifted again, small, almost insignificant, but real. He moved past me then, stepping behind the desk, his space, his control, reclaiming it without words. "You will find that this house runs efficiently without your input," he said, his tone returning to that controlled neutrality. I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. "I am not here to interfere," I replied, "I am here to exist." That made him pause, just for a second, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the desk, as if the word itself had weight he had not anticipated. Exist, not serve, not obey, not belong, just exist. I turned then, not waiting for dismissal, not asking for permission, because I had already taken both by stepping into the room in the first place. As I reached the door, his voice came again, quieter this time, almost thoughtful. "Most people in your position would be more careful." I stopped, my hand resting lightly against the frame, considering that. Then I glanced back over my shoulder, meeting his gaze one more time, most people are afraid of losing something, I said, my voice softer now, but no less certain. I already lost everything before I got here. The truth settled between us, not dramatic, not loud. Just present, and for the first time, I saw it clearly, not in his words, not in his posture, but in the silence that followed. Victor Kane did not know what to do with someone who had nothing left to bargain with, and that made me more dangerous to him than anything he had ever paid for. The door closed behind me with a soft click, but his words stayed with me longer than they should have, not because they held power, but because they revealed something he did not intend to show, and as I walked down the hallway, my steps slow and deliberate, I realized I had crossed a line that most people in this house would never dare approach, not physically, but mentally. I had stepped into his space and walked out without asking, without apologizing, and that kind of action did not disappear, it lingered, it reshaped perception. I could feel it in the way the air shifted again, subtle, controlled, but different. The staff did not look at me the same way now, not just as the new wife, not just as part of the structure, but as something undefined, and undefined things made people pay attention. I reached the main floor and paused near the staircase, letting the stillness settle around me. Because stillness could be louder than movement if you let it. Margaret appeared again. As precise as ever, but this time her gaze lingered a fraction longer, studying, recalibrating. "Will you be dining here this evening?" she asked, her voice as composed as before, but there was something else beneath it now, something closer to curiosity. I considered the question, not for the answer, but for the implication. Meals here were not just about food, they were about presence, about who sat where, who was acknowledged, who was not. "Yes," I said simply. At the main table, her expression did not change, but I saw the shift, the calculation, because that was not the usual pattern, not for someone in my position. "Of course," she replied, inclining her head slightly before stepping away, and I knew that decision would reach him before I ever saw him again, not as a report, but as a ripple, something small that would eventually touch everything. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly, but not idly. I did not retreat to the room, did not isolate myself in a space that could easily become a boundary. Instead I moved through the house again, slower this time, more deliberate, observing not just the structure, but the rhythm, when doors opened, when they closed, how voices changed depending on who was present, how silence was used as a tool rather than an absence. By the time evening settled in, I understood more than I had that morning, not everything, not even close, but enough to know where I stood, and more importantly, where I did not. The dining room was already prepared when I arrived, the same long table, the same precise arrangement, but this time, 2 settings instead of 1. I took my seat without hesitation, not at the far end, not in a position that suggested distance, but closer to the center, a choice that did not ask for permission. The clock on the far wall ticked softly, each second stretching just enough to be noticed, and then, right on time, he entered. Victor Kane did not rush, did not hesitate, he simply existed in the space as if it had been built around him. His gaze moved to the table, to the setting, and then to me, and for a moment, nothing was said, because silence, again, was doing the work. He took his seat across from me, not acknowledging the shift in placement, not commenting on the decision I had made, but I saw it. The way his eyes lingered just a second longer than necessary, registering, recalculating. Dinner was served without interruption, the staff moving with practiced efficiency, placing each dish with quiet precision. I ate calmly, not rushing, not waiting, just existing in the moment as if this was normal, as if this had always been my place. And across from me, he watched, not constantly, not openly, but enough for me to feel it without needing to look. Halfway through the meal, he finally spoke, his voice low, controlled, but carrying something different this time, something less dismissive, more deliberate. "You are adapting quickly." It was not praise, not quite observation, something in between. I set my fork down gently before answering, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I am not adapting," I said, my tone even, unwavering. "I am deciding." The words settled between us, quiet but undeniable, and for the first time since this began, the silence that followed did not feel like his, it felt shared, and that changed everything. He did not respond immediately, and that was how I knew the balance had shifted again, not completely, not in a way that anyone else would notice, but enough to make the silence stretch differently between us. I picked up my glass, taking a slow sip of water, not breaking eye contact, not filling the space with unnecessary movement, because I had learned something about him already. He respected control, not obedience. And there was a difference, a quiet one, but a powerful one. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers resting against the table with that same precise stillness that defined everything about him. "And what have you decided?" he asked, his tone measured, not challenging, not dismissive, something closer to genuine interest, and that was new. I set the glass down carefully before answering, letting the moment settle just long enough to matter. "That I will not disappear here," I said, my voice calm. Not loud, not defiant, just certain. Something in his gaze sharpened, not in anger, but in focus, like he was adjusting to a variable that refused to behave the way it should. "No one is asking you to disappear," he replied, smooth, controlled, the kind of answer that sounded reasonable on the surface but carried something else underneath. I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it was predictable. "No," I said quietly. "You just built a place where it is easy to." That made him pause. Just for a fraction of a second, but I saw it. I was starting to see all of it now, the small hesitations, the recalculations, the moments where certainty shifted into something less defined. The staff moved around us with quiet efficiency, placing dishes, clearing plates, but their presence felt distant, like background noise to something more important unfolding in the space between us. He watched me again. Not with dismissal this time, not with indifference, but with a kind of attention that felt deliberate, chosen. "You speak as if you understand this house," he said, and there was something in his voice now, not quite doubt, not quite curiosity, something in between. I shook my head slightly, not denying, not agreeing, just clarifying. "I understand people," I replied, and that was the truth, the only truth that mattered here, because houses, rules, systems, they were all built around people, and people, no matter how powerful, always followed patterns if you watched closely. "Enough." He held my gaze for a moment longer, searching again, trying to find the edge of what I was, and not finding it easily, and that unsettled him more than anything else could. The rest of the meal passed without much conversation, but the silence was different now, no longer one-sided, no longer owned entirely by him. It moved between us, shared, shaped by both of us instead of controlled by one. When the final plate was cleared, he stood first, as expected, but instead of leaving immediately, he paused, just slightly, his attention lingering on me in a way that felt intentional. "There are expectations that come with this position," he said, his voice low, controlled, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. I rose from my seat slowly, meeting him at eye level as much as the difference in height allowed, not shrinking, not adjusting, just existing as I had been all evening. "Then you should explain them," I said, because I would not assume, and I would not guess, and most importantly, I would not follow rules that had never been spoken out loud. He studied me again, longer this time, as if deciding something, as if measuring the cost of giving me information versus keeping it from me, and then, unexpectedly, he nodded once, a small movement, almost insignificant, but not to me. "Tomorrow," he said simply, before turning and walking away, his steps measured, controlled, but just slightly slower than before. And as I stood there in the quiet that followed, I realized something that settled deep in my chest. This was no longer just about survival, it was becoming something else. Something more complex, more dangerous, because Victor Kane had stopped treating me like something he owned, and had started treating me like something he needed to understand, and men like him did not try to understand anything unless it had the power to change them. The night did not end when he walked away. It stretched, lingered, settled into the walls like something waiting to unfold, and I felt it as I stood there alone in the dining room, the quiet no longer empty but full of something unspoken, something that had shifted between us and refused to go back to what it was before. I did not follow him, did not ask where he was going, because questions were a form of surrender when asked too soon. Instead I turned and walked slowly through the house, letting the silence guide me instead of intimidate me, each step measured, each breath steady, until I found myself back near the east corridor, the same path that had led me to the garden that morning, and without thinking, I stepped outside again, the night air cooler now, the city lights sharper against the darkness, everything quieter, more honest somehow. I wrapped my arms loosely around myself, not from cold, but from habit. The kind that forms when you spend too long taking care of things no one else sees. I moved toward the far end of the garden where the lights faded just slightly, where the perfection softened into something more real, and that was when I noticed her, one of the younger staff members, standing near the edge of the property, her posture tense, her hands clasped too tightly in front of her as if she did not know what to do with them. She startled slightly when she saw me, her eyes widening before she quickly lowered her gaze. "I am sorry, I did not mean to be out here," she said quickly, her voice quiet, careful. I shook my head gently, stepping closer but not too close, not enough to make her feel cornered. "You do not need to apologize," I said, my tone soft but steady. She hesitated, glancing toward the house as if expecting someone else to appear. "It is not usually allowed," she added, and I understood immediately, not the rule itself, but the fear behind it, the invisible lines that had been drawn long before I arrived. I nodded slowly, taking that in, then asked, "What is your name?" She looked up briefly, surprised, as if the question itself was unexpected. "Lily," she answered after a moment, her voice barely above a whisper. I offered a small nod. "I am Emily," I said, not as a title, not as a position, just as a name, something human, something simple. She blinked, confusion flickering across her face, because that was not how this place worked, not how people like me were supposed to speak to people like her. But I did not correct it, did not change it. I just stood there with her in the quiet, letting the moment exist without pressure, without expectation, and slowly, I saw it, the tension in her shoulders eased just slightly, not gone, not fully, but enough to matter. "You should not stay out here too long," she said softly after a moment, glancing again toward the house. "They might notice." I followed her gaze briefly, then looked back at her. "Then we will not give them a reason to," I replied, simple, calm, and something about that seemed to settle her more than anything else had. She gave a small nod, and for a brief second, she almost smiled, almost, before the habit of restraint returned, and she stepped back, excusing herself quietly before disappearing toward the side entrance. I remained where I was for a moment longer, watching the place where she had stood, thinking not about the conversation itself, but about what it meant. Because in a house built on control, the smallest act of kindness became something else entirely, something unexpected, something that did not follow the rules, and as I turned back toward the house, I felt it again, that shift, that presence. I did not need to look to know he was there, but I did anyway, slowly, deliberately, and there he was, standing at the edge of the light just inside the doorway, not interrupting, not announcing himself, just watching, the same way he had that morning. But this time it was different. This time his gaze was not measuring power or control, it was something quieter, something more difficult to define, as if he had just witnessed something he could not place within the world he had built so carefully. And as I held his gaze across the distance between us, I realized that whatever this was becoming, it was no longer something he could dismiss, because for the first time, I had not just disrupted his control, I had introduced something into his world that did not belong to him at all. He did not step forward, and he did not speak, but the space between us felt smaller than it had all day, like something invisible had been drawn tight and neither of us was willing to break it first. I held his gaze for a moment longer, not as a challenge, not as a question, just as acknowledgement, and then I turned back toward the path, choosing movement over stillness. Because standing there waiting for him to define the moment would have undone everything that had changed. I walked past him slowly, close enough to feel the quiet gravity of his presence, the kind that did not need to demand attention because it already had it. But I did not stop, did not hesitate, just continued forward into the house as if that silent exchange had been nothing more than part of the night. Behind me, I heard the door close, soft, controlled, final, and I knew he had followed, not physically close, but near enough that the distance felt intentional. The hallway lights cast long shadows along the walls, stretching and shifting with each step, and for the first time since I arrived, the house did not feel like something I had entered, it felt like something I was beginning to shape. I paused near the base of the staircase, turning slightly as I sensed him stop a few feet behind me. The silence between us settled again, but it was no longer empty, it carried weight now, meaning, something neither of us had fully named yet. "You spoke to one of the staff," he said finally, his voice low, not accusing, not questioning, just stating a fact. I nodded once, not denying it, not explaining it, because explanation implied permission, and I was done asking for that. Yes, I replied simply, and for a moment, nothing followed. I could feel him watching me again, not with that distant detachment from before, but with something sharper, more focused, as if he was trying to understand the intent behind something that did not fit into his system of control. That is not necessary, he said after a moment, his tone calm, but carrying a subtle edge, not of anger, but of discomfort, and that told me more than his words ever could. I turned fully then, meeting his gaze directly, steady, unflinching. Neither was marrying me, I said, my voice quiet but unwavering, the words settling between us with a kind of stillness that made everything else fade. His expression did not change immediately, but I saw it, that slight shift beneath the surface, the recalculation, the moment where control met something it could not easily contain. Everything I do is necessary, he replied, but this time, the certainty in his voice was not absolute, it was measured, tested, and that was the difference. I took a small step closer, not enough to challenge, just enough to exist within his space without asking. Then you should know, I said softly, I am not here to be managed. The words were simple, but they carried more than defiance, they carried truth, the kind that did not need to be proven because it already existed. He held my gaze longer this time, searching, not for weakness, but for something else entirely, something he had not expected to find, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost thoughtful. You think that changes anything? It was not a dismissal, not entirely, more like a question he had not intended to ask out loud. I let a small breath out, not a sigh, not relief, just acknowledgement of the moment. I think it already has, I replied, and that was when it happened, not something visible, not something anyone else would notice, but something real, something that settled deep beneath the surface of everything that had come before. Victor Kane did not respond, not immediately, but he did not look away either, and in that silence, I understood something I had not fully seen until now. This was not just a transaction anymore, not just a contract built on debt and power. It was becoming something else, something neither of us had planned for, something that did not belong to him or to me alone. And as I turned and walked up the stairs without waiting for his answer, I realized the truth that would change everything moving forward. He might have brought me into his world, but he no longer controlled what I would become inside it.